"Forward, the Light Brigade!"
Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew. Someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600.
Alfred Lord Tennyson's take on one of the greatest blunders in military history, the charge of the Light Brigade when Lord Cardigan led 670 cavalrymen straight into the Russian guns on the 24th of October 1854, the Battle of Balaclava during the Crimean War. Millions of soldiers have needlessly died over the centuries because of bad planning and wretched blunders on the part of senior officers and of politicians. Take World War I, for instance, the likes of Passchendaele, the Somme, Gallipoli. They were battles that led to the pointless deaths of thousands of the men who will be commemorated next Thursday, November the 11th, and this day week on Remembrance Sunday. Not that such disasters were unique to the Great War. Think of the Little Bighorn, for example, or Pearl Harbor, the Bay of Pigs, many more besides. Call us with your views on 1850 715 150. You can text us on 51551, especially if you think we might miss some of the really bad blunders. Follow us on Twitter at RTE History Show. We'll be checking also our email, history@rte.ie, throughout the programme. Joining me to recall some of the least distinguished moments in military history are Dr. Robert Gerwarth of the School of History and Archives in University College Dublin and Lar Joye, Military History Curator at the National Museum of Ireland. You're both very welcome indeed to the programme. Lar, let's look first of all at some of the reasons why military engagements go badly wrong. First of all, there are the generals who are on occasion unfit to command flesh and blood troops.
This is a big problem, is that many generals, they spend their careers in the army, maybe 30 or 40 years, never fighting a war, and all of a sudden find themselves having to fight a war towards maybe their 60s or 70s. And this is the case with, as you play there, the charge of the Light Brigade. You have three generals, Lord Raglan, General Lucan and General Cardigan, and all of them are incompetent generals. And were not really talking to each other and had never really fought a war between the three of them. So on the day of the charge of the Light Brigade, Lord Raglan, who's on top of a mountain, sends an order down to Lucan, who's in charge of all the cavalry horses or cavalry regiments in the Crimea, and tells him to charge the guns. And the guns he's talking about are British guns that are being taken away by the Russians. However, Lord Lucan can't see the guns and then turns to General Cardigan and says, let's charge the Russian guns, because the guns he can see. And there you have the greatest blunder, probably, and most well-known blunder that we have, with the charge of the Light Brigade, and 600 men charged down the mountain or down the valley. And of course, as you say, that's an example of kind of unfit to command. Three generals who really shouldn't have been involved in a war like this. Lucan could have turned around and said he didn't want to charge because he couldn't see the guns or ask further questions, but he didn't. He just simply turned to Cardigan and said,
not
charge.
the reason why, Lar. That's
yes.
the problem. Robert, the German losses at the Battle of Verdun, was that down to bad leadership in the field of the kind that Lar's been talking about, or a bad original decision to try and bleed the French army white? Tell us a little bit about Verdun.
Well, I think a number of factors lead to the disaster that became Verdun, one of the most costly battles of the First World War, both on the German side and on the French side. Following the initial disaster of the Battle of the Marne, during which the German invaders were repelled, and the attempt of the Germans to capture the French capital, Paris, was basically rejected by French military power. The commander, the chief of staff of the German army, von Moltke, had a nervous breakdown, and essentially the Germans decided to change tack. What that meant was that the new commander, Erich von Falkenhayn, was trying to force a decisive battle. A battle during which the French would face the German army, the combined German forces on the Western Front, and this military strategy went horribly wrong because the German High Command failed to achieve its two main objectives. First of all, to capture the strategically important city of Verdun, and secondly, to inflict a much higher casualty rate on the French, or, as you say, to phrase it in the words of Falkenhayn himself, to bleed the French army white.
But surely the common knowledge at this point, because we're talking about 1916 essentially, was that it cost more in terms of lives to attack than it did to defend. The Germans were attacking, the French were defending. It would seem logical that the Germans would therefore bleed themselves white rather than bleed the French white.
Well, Falkenhayn was convinced that the French were weaker than they actually were, and that they were far less determined to hold the ground than they eventually were. He also believed in the German material advantage at Verdun, and he felt that if he managed to capture Verdun, the entire French defence would fall, and they could then concentrate on the British forces.
Okay, and it cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Lar, another common problem is bad planning. Tell us what the 6 Ps are.
The 6 Ps are the piss-poor planning leads to piss-poor performance, which is a constant problem in military and causes a large number of problems for them. Probably the most famous one, as you mentioned earlier on, is Gallipoli and the landings at Suvla-Blay. And the whole Gallipoli campaign was a strategic disaster for the Allies in World War I. And it was really down to poor planning of objectives, especially on Suvla-Blay. When the Allies landed in August, they dilly-dallied around the beaches and didn't get onto the higher ground, and very quickly the Turks took the high ground and tackled them. In World War II, you've got other disasters due to planning. The Dieppe raid in 1942, which is the fault of Captain Mountbatten, or the Earl Mountbatten, who was in charge of special operations during World War II and a favourite of Churchill.
This was a kind of rehearsal for D-Day. This was an attempt to show that they could do it, that they could actually land troops on French soil.
This was a big plan in 42. They were going to carry out about 13 to 15 separate little attacks, if you like, along the French coast to keep morale up on the home front, and also to test their ideas. And as you say, this was a big plan, as they'd attack Dieppe, which is a sizable town on the coast. Of course, British planners, but the people actually doing the fighting were the Canadians. And 5,000 Canadians landed on the beach in Dieppe, and 70% of them became casualties within about 2 hours and were completely wiped out.
I'm sure that was great for morale.
Complete disaster, of course, hushed up very, very quickly and never really talked about publicly until after World War II, and of course a great bugbear for many Canadians who saw themselves being sent down the Swanee by the British planners.
Okay, and Robert, the German First World War offensive in March 1918, it was designed to end the war before the USA got involved. Why did it fail, and why did it fail pretty miserably after some outstanding initial success? Because it turned the tide of the war, but in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Well, the 1918 Spring Offensive is, I think, a very clear example of military desperation. The Germans are desperately trying to defeat the French and the British after they themselves had defeated the Russian troops on the Eastern Front, before fresh American troops would arrive in Europe. So this spring offensive, also known as the Ludendorff offensive, aimed to push through the Western Front with the help of nearly 50 divisions which had been freed up by the Russian surrender earlier that year, to push through all the way to the Allied lines, outflank the British troops protecting the Somme, and to defeat their main opponent, the British Army, in battle. After that, so Ludendorff believed, the French would see reason and seek an armistice. So I think the reason why this failed, despite the incredible gains of territory made by the German army in the spring of 1918, was perhaps poor planning. The Germans didn't have much time to plan this offensive, and eventually the supply lines broke down. So whereas the shock troops within the German army managed to gain a lot of territory, the German supplies, the artillery and so on and so forth, could not follow. So eventually, by late April 1918, the danger of a German breakthrough had passed, and the German army had also suffered very heavy casualties and now occupied ground of dubious value, which would prove impossible to hold on because there were fewer and fewer manpower reserves available.
Some of your texts coming into 51551. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union, has to be the worst military blunder in World War II. As far as I know, it resulted in the deaths of millions of soldiers. Hopefully we'll get time to talk to Robert about that one. And another texter says possibly one of the greatest military blunders of all time was on our own doorstep. That was the 1916 Rising, where an untrained Irish force took on the might of the British Empire with disastrous results. Well, one of the worst blunders of the Great War was Winston Churchill's insistence on sending a British, French Anzac force to invade Turkey as a means of drawing German troops away from the deadlock of the Western Front. Here's one description of the debacle that took place when the Dublin and Munster Fusiliers attempted to land on a landfall designated The Beach in Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915.
Directly the vessel ran aground, a very heavy fire was opened on her from the shore, and in a very short time those in the boats were wiped out, very few getting ashore. I don't think that out of about 240 men who were in the boats that more than 40 of them got ashore without being hit. After a time, I noticed these men sunk from exhaustion and loss of blood and were drowned. The water by this time all along the shore, and especially around the boats, was red with blood. The shore now was littered with dead from the boats, and some of the wounded who could had managed to crawl up the beach and were under cover of a bank.
The words of Lieutenant Guy Nightingale of the Munster Fusiliers at V Beach in Gallipoli. I think Churchill thought, Lar, that they would have no problem in taking beachheads in Gallipoli and in moving inland. Overconfidence. To what extent does overconfidence play a part in military disasters?
It plays a big role. In Gallipoli, there's an overconfidence in the sense that there's a feeling that the Turks aren't up to the game, and that the Turkish soldiers wouldn't be strong enough, well trained enough to fight European white troops. And of course, the Allies, especially on V Beach that day, 1,000 Irishmen killed, learned the hard way. And this overconfidence in seeing that the enemy is not really up to a good fight, it happens throughout military history.
General Custer experienced it as well, didn't
General Custer is a classic example. The perception among many American troops fighting in the Indian Wars in the late 19th century was the Indians were a savage race that could easily be dominated. And Custer charged into that situation and kind of got surrounded very, very quickly. The Indians, there was almost 5,000 of them. There was only about 250 troops with Custer. The Indians also were very well equipped. They had some of the latest rifles.
They were better armed than the Americans were.
And these things that he was fully aware of, but however, he thought by simply charging into a situation.
Somebody mentions Isan Luana in the Zulu Wars. They say Eddie Jordan is possibly the worst British military disaster up to that point.
A complete disaster. Actually, 1879 is a bad year for the British Army. They also lose Kabul and lose about 2,000 troops at Kabul in Afghanistan. In South Africa, in Iswalana, they lose almost 15,000 troops, or 1,500 troops, against the Zulu army, who outfight them completely, surround them and completely defeat. Again, overconfidence. They feel that they can fight the Zulus very quickly in a war. And of course, the battle's never really talked about, because 2 days later we have Rorke's Drift, and that's the one that becomes very popular in Victorian England. And of course, since the 1960s with Michael Caine, is a story that we know of the Zulu Wars. But of course, that only involved 150 Welshmen standing out in Rorke's Drift and defending themselves against the Zulus. The disaster had happened 2 days previously.
2 days beforehand. And a texter says, during World War I, a German general is said to have observed the English fight like lions. Yes, a staff officer famously replied, but they are led by donkeys. In relation to overconfidence, Robert, just to go back to one of our previous texters there, and Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of Russia, was that an underestimate on the part of Hitler? Was that overconfidence that he could take the Russians?
Oh, it was an underestimate, and I would say was bordering on megalomania. Clearly, the German Blitzkrieg strategy did not work in Eastern Europe. It was always clear to Germany's military planners that the war in the East had to be won very quickly, ideally by December 1941, so within 6 months, or that it couldn't be won at all. So the lightning victories of the German Wehrmacht of the early months of the war had made them overly confident that they could beat the Russians, despite a severe material disadvantage, and also, of course, a disadvantage in terms of military personnel available. They believed that they could invade quickly, and of course, up until the beginning of the winter of 1941, that strategy worked rather well. It ended in the winter of 1941 at the gates of Moscow.
Nobody had ever heard of Napoleon.
Well, you would have thought that they should have heard of Napoleon, and of course the very name of that military campaign, Barbarossa, had historical connotations. It sort of helps to explain, perhaps, the overconfidence with which the Nazis entered Russia, in the sense that it was perceived by Hitler and many other Nazis at the time as a kind of crusade against an enemy who was racially inferior. and therefore could not withstand the German onslaught.
Some more contributions coming in on our text line and our phone line, which is 1850 715 150. Somebody suggests O'Neill marching south in winter for the Battle of Kinsale in 1601. Well, he wasn't given much choice because that's where the Spaniards landed. What about the Battle of Mount Street Bridge? That's Pat in Cork. Well, somebody's already mentioned 1916, and as an occasion in which the British Army didn't exactly cover itself in glory. The encirclement and capture of 250,000 Soviet troops at Kiev in September 1941. And a question from somebody on our comment line: have any military commanders ever been charged because of an appalling mistake that led to soldiers losing their lives? And if not, why not? Or is all fair in love and war? Does anybody can anybody enlighten me on that one?
No, I don't think most generals normally retire. Sometimes in great shame, but often they just retire very, very quickly afterwards.
Decent pension as well.
Decent pension.
Okay, now our own country, before we conclude this one, has not been a disaster-free zone when it comes to battles and skirmishes. I recently talked to the distinguished military historian Keith Jeffrey of Queen's University in Belfast and asked him what he considered to be the biggest blunder in 20th century history and military history. His response was a little bit surprising.
Well, there are quite a lot to choose from, of course. But if you're thinking about military operations that go badly wrong because the soldiers don't know what they're supposed to do, it has to be Bloody Sunday, I'm afraid, in Derry. There was the highly professional British Army unit, trained up to the eyeballs, and they panic. They break ranks, they lose discipline, and they do precisely what you're not supposed to do in crowd-controlled circumstances. That is inevitably fight with one hand tied behind your back. That's the difference between the state and the challengers to the state, with disastrous political consequences.
So that's Keith Jeffrey's choice for the military disaster, the most obvious military disaster of the 20th century. Barbarossa wasn't a military blunder, says one texter. The blunder was to send some of the army group centre to the south when they were at the gates of Moscow. Dave says the First World War had many atrocities against innocent people, never mentioned as some of our own involved. And Joe says the Light Brigade were approximately 85% Irish. Didn't know that. And in Kinsale, someone sold someone out. Well, somebody just landed in the wrong place. Is modern warfare more humane? One caller says that it was in times gone by. I'm thinking this because nowadays you don't hear of soldiers being fed to the enemy like fodder. It's Commemoration Day, or it's Armistice Day on Thursday, and then Remembrance Sunday is this day week next Sunday. But not something that is observed to any great extent, Robert, in Germany, the commemoration of Armistice Day.
No, that's true. Armistice Day is certainly not a public holiday in Germany, which has a number of reasons. Well, first of all, the 9th of November plays a far greater role in German collective memory as the day that the German Revolution started, which, of course, in the aftermath of the First World War, was always highlighted by German nationalists as the real reason why the German army failed. This is complete nonsense, but it used to be a very popular idea. The second reason why the First World War more generally doesn't play as big a role in Germany as it does in Britain or indeed in Ireland is, of course, the memory has been overshadowed by that of the Second World War, with far greater casualties in Germany and the complete destruction of German cities. So the memory of the Second World War and the Holocaust plays in some ways a greater role. On the other hand, there are certain examples, such as Verdun, as places of memory that have become increasingly popular in German culture. Some of the listeners will remember the famous visit of German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and French President Mitterrand in the mid-1980s, where the two were holding hands on the battlefields of Verdun, as a sort of classic example of post-war reconciliation.
And Lar, finally, Remembrance Day hasn't been a major event in this country since the 1930s.
No, after 1922, it was 1916, the heroic failure was really the event that was celebrated. Even the War of Independence was kind of glanced over. But the week-long rising was something that everyone could associate with, and with the executions afterwards, the impact on Irish history, and it kind of fitted in maybe into Irish mythology.